We have 2 more sessions to go. First up, we have Juhani and Jasper talking about cross-platform tools in the real world. So please welcome Juhani and Jasper. Thank you.
Thank you. So, hello everybody. I'm the one, Juhani. As I always say, don't worry about my last name. Finnish names are impossible to pronounce. And this is my business partner, Jasper, and his last name is much easier to pronounce.
Yeah, a bit easier to say.
Very quickly, we very few, but it's good. How many of you are developers here, approximately? Almost everybody. How many of you are not developers? Everybody's too afraid to lift hands because I will ask what you do. Android, web, iOS, good.
Yeah. Cross-platform? Anyone? Good.
So just very quickly, if my clicker starts working, great, good start. Let me reconnect. That's always a good start for anything. There we go. So just to frame what we're talking about, it's been a full day of very technical talks. There's a lot of very technical Flutter talks especially. We're not here to teach you any platform. We're not here to talk and explain all the details, or some details, but not all the details. So this is not the technical talk, hopefully you weren't looking for. So we're going to talk about other kind of things.
So cross-platform is a topic that we've come across many times in the years and years we've been building native iOS and Android apps. For a while, that whole topic seemed to get quiet, and our customers didn't ask us about it. We didn't want to talk to them about it too much, and we've been very much in a native sort of environment on the mobile side for a while. But recently, actually, we've been hearing more and more about cross-platform, and customers are starting to ask us more and more. So we kind of wanted to come back to this topic and look at it again, try and be somewhat objective. We've been pretty opinionated in the past. And so we kind of want to talk to you today just to look at cross-platform as it looks like today. Some of the promises met, some of them not met, and why it's still worth talking about. So cross-platform in itself is really not new, and it's certainly not new just for mobile. It's an old ideal that we can really push back to Java Foundation classes in '97, and if anyone was working with these back then, you'll kind of recognize this. This is a demo of sort of widgets or UI elements from the Swing toolkit. And then a couple of years later, another sort of early toolkit for cross-platform UI came in the Smalltalk world with VisualWorks, and that looked probably not even quite as good as Swing. And for those of you who are really interested in Smalltalk and winding back the clock, you can actually still build UIs, cross-platform UIs with Smalltalk, and you can get the link to download that SDK from the slides here. So we've had a couple of early, in the desktop world, attempts at doing cross-platform UIs. And that kind of triggered, actually, a few more players coming to the market. And I'll run through these really quickly. We're not going to talk about them in detail, but it's just to give you a sense that this cross-platform story isn't new. It's been emerging for a long time. So around 2000, we had sort of Java on mobile, on feature phones. Zool, if that's familiar to anyone, came out of the Firefox project. Beloved Adobe Flex, which I'm sure everybody loves, was Adobe's attempt to put Flash on the desktop. Microsoft thought that was also a great idea and brought out Silverlight with a slightly bigger ambition to go from desktop to web and then eventually into mobile. But I guess we kind of know what happened there. HTML5 was a kind of a good moment, I think, in this history of cross-platform before mobile. But Adobe, of course, wanted to have its say and kind of jumped in with Adobe Air, which is a kind of a Frankenstein of HTML and Flash and everything to run on the desktop. Until something else happened.
Mobile. So these people started selling phones, so then the landscape changed quite a bit. And of course, then more and more platforms were available and more platforms became relevant. So, you know, I actually think this was called Phone Gap at the beginning already, but the Phone Gap was one of the first ones, so Cordova. Titanium Accelerator popped up. Adobe bought Phone Gap, I think, at this point, and renamed it back to Phone Gap. We have Xamarin for Microsoft. Everybody needs to try something. Native script. React Native. So all of these things started happening. And then we have Capacitor at the end. So point out that this one is not very old anymore. This one just last year. So these things just keep popping up.
OK, great. So over 20 years of cross-platform UI. It's pretty amazing. So we've reached the promised land, right? Life is fantastic. Well, I think most people in the room know that reality is not quite what it could be, right? Not quite what we'd like it to be. We're still a bit of an aspiration. So why is that? You know, why are we not living in the world of cross-platform heaven? So we think there are five reasons why cross-platform has ultimately failed to date. So early on, runtimes were a challenge, and runtimes have not been accepted everywhere. And I think the best example of that was the unhappiness of Adobe when Apple said, we're not allowing Flash on iPhones. So basically, Flash lost out on mobile computing world. And ultimately, along with HTML5, it ended up to Adobe announcing the end of life of Flash in this rather curious way. But I think there are some people are a little bit more happy about it. Chrome seemed to be a bit more enthusiastic in their announcements, and Firefox. But it's not just Flash that had that problem. Silverlight in the browser we saw was also not really well welcomed always. You know, in Chrome, we're in version 79, something like that at the moment, all the way back version 42. Already Silverlight was not really welcome. So, okay, Silverlight has also ended support. Kind of amazingly, this was written in 2019 still. So people have been holding on to this promise. But the platform support has to be there, and in these cross-platform solutions, it was not.
Then there was other approach, was to try to pretend you're part of the platform, but you actually weren't. This is a good example. I took the screenshot yesterday. One of these is an app, one of these is a website. The app is just a wrapper. It runs some web view on Android and iOS. The wrapper actually works worse. Copy-paste doesn't work, for example, and a lot of these things. There's a lot of problems. On the browser, it works perfectly fine. And then when you install an application and you see this in an app, you're like, OK, this is not going to be very nice. Kind of a continuation, that one, pretending to be, is things that just don't look right. This goes way back. You have Java Swing UIs running different platforms. It worked everywhere, but it didn't look nice anywhere. So whatever platform we dropped it on, it always looked wrong. The icons were wrong. The file picker was wrong. All of these things that we still have a little bit. So this is a quote when I kind of tirade against cross-platform, get quite often. So it's like, OK, it's the same on iOS and Android especially. Why do we write code twice to draw the same? Superficially, this argument is solid. So I have nothing against the person who gave this argument to me, but I think they are wrong. User experience is different than pixels. The app is not just drawing pixels on screen, the app is actually using the application. There's a lot of things that are around it. Transitions, scroll speed, how the tabs work, how are the interactions work, what kind of gestures you can do. All of these things pile on top of this one. To me, user experience is the #1 priority, and that's the #1 reason I've been disliking these tools. The other thing is, and people send me a screenshot of React Native or something, and they say, you can't tell that this is not native. True, I can't tell from the screenshot, but let me use it. Now, it might be that Xamarin application, for example, I cannot tell that it's not native by even using it for a while. But we come to this term, uncanny valley, which probably people know from computer games and animating human faces and so on. You can't quite tell why it's wrong. You cannot say a single thing why it's wrong, but it just feels wrong. And this usually comes from, again, scroll speed is a bit different than it is. The activities transitions are different. And you ask me, I can't tell you what is the reason why it's bad, but I can tell it's bad. And it's a very difficult argument then to have. This is some people who might have followed me longer time. I used to write actively blog posts a long time ago. I've been hating this cross-platform idea for a long time. This is from 2012. And this article I got yelled at by the guys at Accelerator or Titanium platform people. They didn't like this post.
So a fourth reason why cross-platform seems to have failed to date is it's been plagued by this specter of poor performance. Resource usage has not been always good with cross-platform solutions, and over time, this is not always the case. You can always write apps badly. You can always write poor-performing apps no matter what technology you use. But it hasn't really quite gone away yet. And the reputation for cross-platform being super performant isn't really obvious. And kind of recently, we'll talk about the Airbnb a little bit later. Still to date, big companies with huge tech investments are still having problems with performance on cross-platform. And then finally, was I talking about this one, or you want to talk about this one?
I can talk about this one. Because we had this, so we wrote this this post about this, and we drew this graph. This might not be fully accurate, and there's no data behind this, so don't yell at me. I just ask my designer to draw it because it looks nice. But I have this problem of, this comes from the frustration of seeing Flutter demos, especially Flutter demos, and it's not possibly the Flutter. I think the curve is getting better and better, but what I always saw when people talk to me about cross-platform is that, it works great. And what they do, they stand on stage, they spend 30 minutes, they write an application that has a list, and you can swipe to dismiss, and you always see the same demo, or use something very similar, and say, look, Flutter is amazing. Great, it's definitely amazing for that use case, but it's good for the other stuff. And it is like trying to figure out where you actually being, and this is you kind of box yourself in, and you can't get out of it. So this has been in the past. Okay, we'll talk about the React Native story from the Airbnb. Gabriel, most of people read about this blog post. So this is not, I think this blog post is super fair. Gabriel, he didn't attack React Native as much as I think he should have. But the story was, there's a lot of different problems, and they decided after a huge amount of investment to pull the whole platform from there. There's a couple of quotes here. We're not going to go through all the quotes, I think we have short on time. But these slides are going to be available afterwards, so you can read through them. The whole point was that they invested a lot, but they still have to go back on the thing. The other big story, this happened this year, I think, early this year, August. Dropbox pulled their cross-platform efforts, but their platform effort was a bit different. They went C++ for the backend. So their problems were a bit different. The technical C++ worked fine, but they didn't find the C++ developers. They couldn't really figure out how to get it working in sense. Their tools were non-standard. They had a lot of different problems in this one. So why are we still talking about this and why are we here?
Yeah, so, we kind of saying 20 years of cross-platform UI and it's still broken, right? So it turns out that the reason why cross-platform never really dies is actually there's some real problems. Companies have real problems building across lots of different platforms, and those problems don't die. Therefore, the attempts to try and fix them don't die. So what are these problems? And we're just going to run through a few of them that we see with our customers, and you might see with your customers as well. Cost. Yeah, multiple platforms is expensive. You've got to have bigger teams with, more developers, more designers, project managers, etc. It naturally leads to more cost. Some companies have endless sums of money. Hopefully your companies have endless sums of money, but a lot of companies don't. And along with the cost comes larger development teams. Now, I don't know, my experience of large development teams has not been a good one. It gets to a point where people start showing you slides like that, and that kind of ruins your day. Because to manage large development teams is a job in itself. You end up spending more time in managing the teams and coordinating the teams than you actually do getting the work done. And this might be familiar to some people as well. Lines of communication between people explode as you add a few people to your team. Down the bottom, we get 91 lines of communication with just 14 people. So if you've had experience of being in development teams of like 40, 50 plus, it's not a great experience, right? And it's very hard to manage. It can be managed, but there are not many organizations with the skills to do that. Yeah, this is pretty obvious, but actually you feel the pain when you're part of the delivery team. You're trying to deliver the same features 3 times, 4 times, depending on the number of platforms. You try and do the same bug fixing, the same amount of testing, and this pain keeps going. It's not just about getting your app out the door. It goes into the lifetime of the apps across the different platforms. So you keep doing the same work again and again in different teams for different platforms, and you start to get a sense of just repeating yourself. I'll keep going. So we keep talking about cross-platform, and customers are, of course, acutely aware on mobile because there's iOS and Android. Quite often customers are also reaching out to their customers through web. That's pretty typical. But we think that this is just the starting point, and cross-platform is going to mean a whole lot of other classes of devices. We're probably starting to get into home automation more and more, probably the geeky guys in the room. Cars, wearables, it's all coming out now. 5G is probably going to change the game. People talking about advertisements, digital advertisements at bus stops and stuff. Those are all going to have some sort of cross-platform user interface needs. And I took a photo this morning at breakfast. This is the coffee machine in the hotel, right? It's got a user interface. Somebody's built this, installed it, it's running, and that's a coffee machine. So you can get a sense that this cross-platform problem is just going to grow and grow and grow. And the last reason why we think that cross-platform is not going away as a topic, and the pains aren't disappearing just because we're embedded in delivering native as the best of breed solution, is that actually you get into lots of feature parity questions. The more customers you work with, the more you start to see, some customers favor one platform. You get some environments where one platform is really dominant amongst users, and other platforms are smaller but can't be quite ignored. And over time, you tend to see challenges where platforms fall behind, and in some cases fall behind quite badly. I'm thinking about a UK bank, a startup bank, where Android has been, there hasn't even been any lock screen, sort of pin entry, whatever, for months and months and months after that feature was added to Android. And this is not happening through lack of care and attention. This is just happening because there's pressure to deliver for key platforms, and that doesn't roll out naturally to all the platforms. Skill shortages is one that we wish wasn't there. It feels quite a weak argument, but unfortunately it is there. And we just have to accept the fact that not every company can hire great teams of engineers for iOS and Android and web and what have you. It's a problem. And we see companies having to do things like cross-training. We see companies putting lots of work out to external companies. We're an external company for a lot of our clients. But ultimately, that's a kind of a weak position for a business to be in, to have reliance on an external company. And you don't really want to have that for a long time. And this isn't just for small companies. It's not just for kind of classic companies like old school banks or guys who naturally haven't been digital. This problem is happening to some of the bigger names in the tech space today. Even as we'll talk about this React Native topic for Airbnb, this was a key problem for them. They just didn't have the size and scale of their mobile engineering team, and so they sought another solution. So, yeah. UI convergence, I think you wanted to talk about that.
I can talk about. So I think one thing that is changing for sure, the platforms are coming closer to each other. If we talk about iOS and Android now, it seems like Google has given up to trying to be different just to be different, which I think is good. I'm an Android user. I've been fanatic Android supporter since 2.0 or something like that. And at the early phases, iOS was massively ahead of user experience. Google was trying to catch up but didn't want to copy, so tried to do different things, and they ended up doing a lot of different things. If you look some of things right now that is happening, for example, bottom navigation, drawers, even swipe to back has come to Android. These things are very, very similar. There's only very few things that interaction-wise are different. Even visually, the platforms are quite similar. Now the headers are in the middle instead of Android on the left and so on. So you start to be very, very close. And this is one of, I think, from my point of view, as somebody who's a UX fanboy, is the thing that allows me to think about, again, or rethinking the user experience. This is a post by Lyft designers. This comes to a little bit what Jasper is talking about, the number of people, lack of resources, and so on. This is very, very nerving as an Android developer. I think if you're Android developers, you're probably in the same place. I know you mentioned something just half an hour ago. It's like there's 28% of Lyft engineers has never got Android designs. And this is a big problem, right? So now we're kind of thinking about, because the platforms are becoming closer and closer, maybe this problem could be solved as well. So, you know, the cross-platform idea will never die because it's needed, it's going to be there. And there's a promise, there's a real need for it. That's why it's been tried so many times. So we wanted to go quickly. Promise it's not going to be super technical, but what we think by our experience, we have 45 years experience in software engineering together, not individually. So we've been looking at this for a long time and basing on our experience. I'm not saying this is the right things, so the opinions are not right things, but this is what we are thinking about. There's 3 things we are looking at. Kotlin Multi-Platform, my thing. I really like the idea. Flutter and WebAssembly, something that I'm not so keen yet, but I'm open to be convinced. Kotlin Multi-Platform. There's a lot of talks about this one as well, so I'm not going to talk technically at all what it's going to be. But in general, it's Android's language. It's the one. It's even last I.O. Google said it's Kotlin first. It's no longer Kotlin's first-tier language. It's now Kotlin first. And all the Android developers I talk to write Kotlin right now. If you still write Java, I would like to ask why. That would be a good question, unless you're forced to do so. So we already have the developers. So some of the problems that we showed before are gone. All of our Android developers are Kotlin multi-platform developers already. Kotlin as a language, this is important to me because we don't want to have the same as Java and let Oracle destroy. Oracle is not sponsored, right? No. So let's not. There's no way any company can destroy Kotlin anymore. It's not owned by JetBrains anymore. It's not owned by Google. It's owned by Kotlin Foundation. So nobody can buy it. Kotlin as a language is clearly loved language. It's on the Stack Overflow, second and third, quite second and fourth seems to be here. in 2 years in a row, the most loved languages in the world. And I think the people who came from Java and went to Kotlin on Android probably quite agree with this one. It is quite nice language. Couple of important things to me. It's not all or nothing. So you can go in various grades of Kotlin Multi-Platform. You can just put your data classes there. You know Kotlin data classes are nice. You can drop them in a library and we put there. The tooling is fantastic. It's built by the same people who built our tools on Android, but JetBrains built IntelliJ and Android Studio. So of course the tooling is amazing. An important thing for the iOS people, it shows as a library. They don't actually have to know it's written by Kotlin, and they don't have to learn Kotlin to do it. However, because Kotlin and Swift are very similar languages, they can fluently read the code even if they don't want to write it. This is something that I think a lot of Kotlin multi-platform people don't bring up. I think important point, it's not for everything. If, for Android people of us, when we talk to the iOS people, let's make a point out of this. It's not that everybody now all of a sudden has to do this. It's a tool. It suits in certain places. And I think 2 requirements are important. The project has to be Android first, because the Android people has to be writing the multi-platform. There's no point forcing the iOS people to go into that world unless they really want to. It has to have business logic in the part of the front end, part of the client package. There's no point writing multi-platform if you just make an application that makes a REST API call and shows what comes in there. If you have difficult business logic in there that you have to replicate, then it starts to make sense. So when you talk about Kotlin multi-platform, don't say it's for everything. It's a great tool. It's going to be stable soon, hopefully. And it's definitely have its uses. If you want to hear more, there's a lot of talks here. Yossi, one of our guys, was talking about it, and there's a link to the slides. At the very last slide, there's a link to these slides, so you can get all the links from us. You don't have to take pictures. Flutter.
So yeah, so Flutter's more my topic, and I'm pushing Flutter at Snapp, so you can tell we probably have some interesting discussions between us. I'm not going to explain too much what Flutter is. There have been quite a few talks about it. It comes from Google. The goal is to be able to build iOS, Android, web, and other apps coming in the future through one code base. So not a unique goal. We've seen this before. But Flutter, I think, is a bit different. And I think the reason it's a bit different is it's actually building along on the learnings we've seen in cross-platform over the years. So what I mean by that? Well, firstly, we've seen cross-platform shifting away from drawing kind of through some sort of layer through to trying to draw natively. Swing, and we saw SWT coming out for those who used Eclipse. Flash kind of died when HTML allowed you to use a canvas and play video directly in browsers. PhoneGap, got a bit of a kick when React Native and Xamarin came along, which come much closer to platform-based UIs. Flutter also avoids trying to take technologies probably from the past and bring it into another context. HTML on mobile, doesn't always feel kind of natural. JavaScript isn't maybe the best runtime to have on mobile or across all sorts of devices. And you even kind of get VMs running on platforms like Mono running on Android. So Dart avoids this problem, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So because it's bundling a large part of the engine, which is good and bad, it increases app size, so it's not a complete win. But at the same time, it doesn't rely on parts of the host system. It doesn't rely on the browser. What type of browser is there embedded? Early days of PhoneGap type apps, you had Android, some with original Android web browsers, some with Chrome, and there were all these differences. So it doesn't have that problem. It doesn't have this plugin problem that we saw in the past with Flash and Silverlight. So it really tries to kind of keep its own footprint and not rely too much on the existence of of these items on the host device. This might be the biggest one. The architectural approach is a little bit different, and there's a different sort of perspective, I think, that's happening in Flutter to what's come in the past, where a lot of cross-platform has said, if we can get the runtime the same across all sorts of devices, then we can run the same code. So we've got a browser on the desktop. We can have a browser on a mobile device. We can have a browser on some sort of terminal. And then we kind of like flatten the differences out between all of them. And the difficulty there is you can end up with a kind of lowest common denominator result. Flutter tries to be a bit different. It's saying, actually, we have the same stack all the time, but actually we can substitute the runtimes. It's a massive goal, right? It's very, very ambitious, but it's fundamentally a different perspective on how you run similar code on different platforms. And to kind of just talk that a little bit more, for anyone who's looked at Flutter, this will be familiar to you. This is basically the kind of architecture of Flutter. We've got the framework at the top, all written in Dart. Then you've got this engine, skier for drawing the graphics directly on the devices. And then underneath, you've got hooks into different platforms, iOS, Android. Embedded API is a kind of a hint that you could do this on Windows, etc. But what about on web? So we don't have any of these skier engines or whatever you can plug into. So the approach from Flutter is to say, well, we keep everything the same, except we actually then have a different runtime. Yeah? So it's not saying we're going to have the same runtime across all devices. We're going to have the same framework and then deploy that out into different runtimes on different devices. Again, it's a big goal. It's not quite proven yet, but it's a fundamental shift in how Flutter is thinking about cross-platform. Dart is number 5, reason why this is a bit of a different approach to what's come in the past. Dart is kind of unknown and a little bit not really loved. It hasn't got the Kotlin fanboy element to it, but it's kind of an interesting language because kind of its failures from its origins have become its strengths. So Dart really was an attempt to replace or fix JavaScript, but the Dart team never got Dart to run natively in the browser. Yeah, the Chrome team had too many other things. It never got onto the release cycle. So that meant that the Dart team were always having to basically compile to JavaScript initially. It compiles straight into ARM and x86 instructions. So it's kind of its failings at the beginning have now turning into its strengths. So it's a unique language which previous cross-platform attempts haven't had this approach in the language. And maybe in the future, I'll talk in a second about WebAssembly, but conceptually, you can kind of see it heading in the direction of compiling into a different type of binary that, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. So, okay, these are the reasons why I think Flutter could be an interesting alternative, an interesting attempt at cross-platform. It's worth looking at least with us. It's something we don't want to discard. And although we've in the past been pretty negative about cross-platform, we're trying to keep open-minded, and we think that if there's genuinely something new, let's take a look at it. But we need to see it in the real world, and we need to see it not just in version 1 or version 1.1, but in version 2.3, etc., as customer apps get released and maintained, etc. So I don't think we're really going to know the answer to this for a year or two. But Flutter actually brings some good things as well, coming from Google, sort of things you'd expect from Google these days: great tooling, great community, lots of materials for learning. Performance is kind of critical from day one in the Flutter team. And the other good thing is that we're not just talking about cross-platform on mobile. They genuinely want to get Flutter running on all sorts of devices, which is a true cross-platform. So I've got a couple of slides about WebAssembly. We don't build things on WebAssembly, so this is not coming from our experience. But if you haven't heard of WebAssembly, it's kind of exciting. Essentially, what WebAssembly does is it allows actual binaries that talk to kind of native parts of the host system to run in the browser. Right. So an example of this, which I recommend you try, is Figma. It's a design tool. The cool thing about Figma is you can run it in the desktop or you can just run it straight in the browser. And this is not JavaScript or anything like this. This is actually written in C++, embedded running in a web page, which is pretty cool. And it's so cool, in fact, that Square said, well, let's start giving our designers pixel books. Yeah. So imagine that, pixel books being a device on the design team. Today, most people are using some sort of Mac device, or some people use Windows. But to have something that's really just a browser-driven OS for doing design is pretty exciting. So the promise of WebAssembly is interesting, and the web is everywhere. So a better web, yeah, could lead to some exciting cross-platform possibilities. Very quickly, just to see how WebAssembly works. Today, 3 supported languages for WebAssembly are C, C++, and Rust. The source code gets compiled into a WebAssembly specific binary, and then the browsers have a WebAssembly runtime. And as of today, Chrome is supported, Safari is supported, Firefox is supported, even Internet Explorer is supported. So WebAssembly runtime is everywhere. I'm not sure about Opera, but maybe that's not a great loss. And then it doesn't take too much imagination to start to say, well, OK, if we've got this browser, ubiquitous browser that's everywhere, and we can write really high-performance code that's actually more like a binary running on a machine, and the browser's really the way to kind of bootstrap running that program, well, you can kind of see conceptually that you can compile into the WebAssembly formats from different languages. Yeah. So that's why I think, WebAssembly is maybe not for today, but as a promise for cross-platform over time, I think WebAssembly is one to watch.
So just to wrap it up, we went through a lot of things. We went through things that sucked in the past. We went through things that we think don't suck so much anymore. Some things that were pretty awesome thing. Now, as somebody who spent 10 years investing all into Android, I put all of my reputation behind Android. Should I be afraid of, am I going to lose my job?
Yes, you're fired.
Oh, well. But the question is, though, what is this world anyway? So if you are in the position where you invested so much into one platform, and new platforms are coming, fighting them and pretending they don't exist is not the right solution for us. The reality is that native Android development, regardless what Google is going to do with Flutter or the next toolkit and so on, is going to be around for a long time. We're still going to be there. And if you look into this one, the skills you learn into this one, at least 50%, maybe 75% are fully applicable to the next framework you do. It doesn't matter if it's Kotlin or Swift or whatever it is, the next ones are going to be. So let's not be afraid of the future. We don't have to worry about our jobs. There's still going to be more Android native developer jobs than there's Flutter jobs for a while. And if the next framework comes, look at it, take a look at it. Leave your bias outside when you look at it, and then just don't just go, it's shit immediately. It's just worth doing this. I think that's what we all have to say. Here's a link to the slides. I will put this on my Twitter as well. If you follow me on Twitter, you can get this. You don't have to type. I don't know if you have time for questions. I think we have a couple of minutes. We're going to be here until the beers at least, so if you want to talk afterwards, that's okay. Any questions, thoughts, comments, telling us we are wrong? No? Okay, let's talk after. Thanks.